Well, welcome everyone to this afternoon's discussion about the general topic of sustainability in libraries, is my understanding of what the topic of the hour is. Our special guest is Dr. Duane Ikerd. He's Professor Emeritus of Agriculture and Applied Economics at the University of Missouri Columbia in the College of Agriculture, Food, and Natural Resources. I hadn't planned for the show and tell, but the titles of some of his many publications are indicative of his lifelong interest in and commitment to a sustainable world, including farms and communities. I chose the same four titles to highlight. So here they are. The Essentials of Economic Sustainability, Sustainable Capitalism, a Matter of Common Sense, Small Farms Are Real Farms, Sustaining People Through Agriculture, and Crisis and Opportunity, Sustainability in American Agriculture. As the state co-coordinator of extension programs in sustainable agriculture, Dr. Ikerd was responsible for implementing a national professional development program for extension workers and others who provided Missouri with information related to sustainable agriculture. Dr. Ikerd was a project leader of a 3-state 5-year program with funding from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, which linked sustainable agriculture and sustainable community development. And I can say when we had dinner last night, that was a real revelation for me in your thinking. Is you talk more about communities and people than animals and crops. All of his degrees, his Bachelor of Science, Master of Science, and PhD are all in agricultural economics from the University of Missouri. He's also served at the University of Georgia, Oklahoma State University, and North Carolina State University. He retired from the University of Missouri in early 2000, and he now spends most of his time writing and speaking on issues related to sustainable agriculture with an emphasis on the economics of sustainability. And he currently lives in the fair state of Iowa, my home state, in Fairfield, Iowa. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Duane Ikerd.
Thank you. I'm here to talk about whatever you want to talk about today. I don't have a particular agenda. I was trying to think if I'd ever been invited before to speak to a group of librarians, and there was one other time. I was invited to Purdue University at an annual conference of the agricultural librarians to talk on food systems. But I've never been invited to someplace by librarians to talk about libraries. So I consulted my friend Margaret Merrill, who's the retired agricultural librarian at Virginia Tech University. In fact, she was the one that invited me to the conference in Purdue for some ideas. And she gave me some ideas. I don't know if you distributed those to the group or not, what I sent to you. But that was just something to get my thinking going as much as anything else. So I want to talk about that. But I think that the key question, maybe in starting a discussion, would be for you all to answer, in dealing with issues of sustainability, do you stick with the traditional role of a librarian as she described it? And it's my understanding that you collect and archive information and make that information accessible to other people? Or do you want to expand beyond that and start collecting and making other things accessible? Like there's libraries and tools that people have had, others have mentioned. I know that there's libraries of seeds now, that you have seed savers that set up libraries where they lend those out. And so I think, at least starting the discussion is the idea that you have to decide what kind of other things is relevant to you. Do you want to stick with the traditional role of collecting and disseminating, making information available? I sent out a suggestion along that line, is that you move beyond just printed information, move beyond even digital information to personal information, so that people deposit their personal experiences, the opportunity to learn from them personally at the library, and somebody else checks those out and uses them, and you facilitate the interaction of people person to person, as opposed to a person interacting with a book or with a video or whatever other kind of resource material. And then in the area of sustainability, if you go beyond, that role of just information, then there's a whole host of things that you could do in terms of sustainability, in terms of helping people, not only share tools, but share vehicles or anything in addition to information. And then, of course, in the traditional role, there's a whole host of new kinds of print and video and digital information that's available that has to do with sustainability that's not very widely distributed, that would be very much in line with your traditional goal. So I'm just going to leave it at that and open it up to discussion. If anybody wants to explore any of those particular things in more detail, then we can do that together, okay?
Well, I'll jump in and say that we just came from a library faculty meeting where we were just talking about this very thing, about, there's this concept of a cultural memory institution where it might be a library, a museum, an archive, and up until maybe like yesterday, we focused on print materials. And digital materials, really just print materials made digital. But now we have an opportunity to really start to expand that. Seeds, maybe not so much, I don't know. I know there are public libraries that circulate bakeware, you know, so if you need the cake in the shape of a number 4, you only need it like hopefully twice. Once when they turn 4, when the child turns 4, maybe when the child turns 14, but they might not like it that you're a cake in the shape of a 4 when you're 14. And hopefully not when they're 24, you're still not using that cake pan. So you're doing that. But we're talking more in terms of, we have a lot of things. We're interested in Ozarks history and culture. And there are a lot of things that are not documentary. They're not books or manuscripts or some kind of a written thing that we think we should collect and provide access to and digitize and preserve.
I guess another one of the questions, you know, what's your kind of clientele or what's your constituency? You know, is it the university and the faculty and the students or the broader community? Because if you open it up in the broader community, then that opens up a whole range of other things. And I think there's things that you can do within the university community that you can't do with the broader community, and there's certainly things you can do with the broader community that is beyond the university community. So I think you're suggesting maybe moving beyond the university community, or maybe not. Maybe just thinking about making those things available to people in the university community.
No, I think that we're also celebrating Public Affairs Week and Public Affairs Conference, the weeks in the fall and conferences in the spring. You know, we're a public university, and we are now Missouri State University. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary with that name, but I think we still see ourselves as a service university to a region. And the Ozarks is an amazing place in many ways, but it's a multi-state region, and some people identify more as being an Ozarker than necessarily Missourian or Oklahoma,
Arkansas, Kansas.
Yeah, a little bit Kansas.
I'm from this area, so I happen to know this.
Yeah.
I think there are certain things that we can do in the library that extend beyond our normal patrons that we would have just at the university. So we probably are looking at 2 different things, because the information we have on the Ozarks, people can get online and see, and a lot of things we have in special collections. So we probably, and we do service the community somewhat, I think we probably are looking at both, kind of internal and external as far as what we can do. And some we're restricted, of course, externally, but we still can have some services, or information that people can get to.
Just might point out, we are a federal and Missouri State Depository Library, and that makes us legally obligated to be open to the public to provide that information.
So that automatically broadens the scope
Right.
in a number of ways.
And we're the only official UN repository in the state.
Forgot that, I'm sorry.
Channeling
Yeah.
You know, there's another part of this I just want to get out there, is that we're also, that's all good, but we're also an organization, just like any other organization. So we're consuming resources and energy. And there's also kind of, you know, we all work in the library, but then we have a lot of people coming into the building who are just using the library. And so even just on that kind of wise use of resources, sometimes we talk in terms of what are we doing in terms of paper consumption, and how can we save energy? But we have about 750,000 people who come into this building every year, and we can't, well, I suppose we could, but it would be a different thing to sort of try to get them to change their information, or their energy consumption while they're in the building. As I commented last night, they all bring in devices, and they want to connect them and recharge them while they're here. And it's kind of the age we live in, that for a lot of stuff, you have to have that device. You can't access an ebook without some kind of way.
Yeah, I think in the area of sustainability, you know, if you want to kind of develop a reputation of being a go-to place on sustainability, then you have to reflect that in the way you run the organization, building, that kind of walk the talk, otherwise you don't have much credibility to come in and say, you've got all this good information, but you're not using it, and it's kind of puts you in kind of a difficult position. I get that all the time out talking about sustainability. Well, what the heck are you doing, you know? So I don't hold myself up as a prime example, but I'm trying to talk to people about how I, you know, work it into my life to the extent that I can, and I think you need to be prepared to do that. You can't do everything all at once.
We are in a period of time where the transition from print to digital resources allows us certain opportunities to enhance sustainability. We just recycled somewhere close to 13 tons of paper about 2 weeks ago, and I don't know what, we don't have the figures back on yesterday's recycling, but that provides an opportunity. But you know, some of the challenges, and some of the rest of you are more involved in this than I, but are the way in which libraries are currently designed are not necessarily done with an eye towards sustainability. I mean, if you look around this building, there's some great examples of that. And so much of it focuses on energy in terms of electrical energy, and we don't, the university and probably the library don't think about other forms of sustainability. You know, those, your field, agriculture. From farm boy, I know that agriculture is one of the biggest consumers of water in the U.S., and we don't think about that here at the library. You know, we use water as if it were endless. Unfortunately, the Ozarks don't have the same problems as California does, but you know, it's one of those things that we really let go.
Right. Well, I think, you know, what you were saying, you can't rebuild the building if this hasn't been designed in a certain way, but I think at the same time you can say, okay, what can you do in a building that hasn't been designed in a certain way, and what do you do within that? Because most people are living in buildings that haven't been designed for energy efficiency, so how do you cope with that? And that's a lot of things I say on sustainability, you know, given the situation that you're in, what's the practical things that you can do that moves you toward a more sustainable lifestyle? And that doesn't, if you go out in most cases and you say, okay, I'm going to live a totally sustainable lifestyle, I'm going to go to just bare bones, whatever, you'll do it for about maybe a month. That's enough of sustainability. It's, you know, it's kind of like, you know, I used to talk, you get to be 50, 60 years old, and you figure out you're out of shape, you haven't been exercising, you're overweight, and a whole bunch of other stuff, so you're really going to get in shape, so you're going to go out and run 5 miles every day. Well, how many days you're going to do that out of shape? You can't run. So you just have to go at it a stage at a time. I have people ask me all the time, well, how do you go to a sustainable lifestyle? And I say, I think you have every decision that you make, and I would say that would be irrelevant here. Every decision that comes up you make, and you say, okay, what are going to be the ecological consequences of that? What's going to be on the environment, the resource, that sort of thing. Start from there, from an ecological sustainability, resource pollution, things of that nature. And then come back to what I see as the second dimension. What's going to be the social dimension now? What's going to be the implications for relationships within the library community, but in the larger community? Is this going to be accessible to everybody? Are we considering the needs of all the people, or just some of the people, or, you know, from a socially responsible area? And then the third one is can we afford it? And I think most of us historically have started, well, what's the cheapest or what's the most profitable, what's going to make me the most money? And then we come down to, well, what's going to be the implication on friendships or family or community? And then finally we get down to the idea of, well, if it doesn't hurt my friendships or it doesn't cost me anything, I'll do what's morally and ethically right with respect to the environment. We can flip that over and say, what's the right thing to do here? And then what's going to be the impact on relationships, and then can I afford it? And you'll find a lot of things that you really want to do that you can't afford, or you live in a culture where that's going to cause problems, and problems are going to be bigger than the solutions. But I think if we approach every decision with that kind of priority in mind, then we begin to move in a different direction. Does that make sense?
Should record that and send it to the Missouri legislature.
It is being recorded. So we just have to send it.
No. And on a more serious note, I think that seems to be one of the issues, particularly the last one, you know, where you can appeal to people's altruism and their social nature, but policymakers tend to focus on short-term economic.
And one reason, after being retired 15 years, I'm still out here as an economist, is that my mission is to say that's wrong, what we're doing now. As long as we continue to focus just on the economics, we're not going to change the other thing. We've got to give priority to, you know, those greater things of nature for the good of humanity. And it comes from, in my books I talk about it comes from what we call the hierarchy of sustainability. It's a different worldview than you typically would have. But within sustainability, we're not apart from the rest of the world. The world just isn't resources here to be used. The whole of society is a part of nature. We're just another species occupying this planet, just like any other species. Everything we do, everything that's of any use to us comes from nature. The air, the water, the soil, the energy, there's no place else. Everything we do has an impact on nature. And so we're a part of nature. So there's basic laws of how nature functions. We're a part of nature, so that determines how we function ultimately. We don't have to respect the laws of nature, but eventually we'll realize the consequences if we don't. You know, I tell people, you can stand up here and argue and say, I don't believe in the law of gravity. I'm not going to pay attention to it, but if you drop something heavy on your toe, it's still going to hurt. And if you violate the other kind of laws of nature, the laws of thermodynamics, says energy can't be created or destroyed, but every time you use it, it loses some of its usefulness. Well, if you continue to use the resources of nature over and over again, you're slowly using up the usefulness. Whether you want to admit it or not, we're doing that. So that has to be the highest priority, is respecting those fundamental laws of nature. And that's what we've been ignoring, and that's where the environmental problems come from. That's where the depletion of resources come from. That's the depletion of the groundwater. Because we basically said, we're going to do what we're going to do, and we don't care about nature, but nature says, this is the way I work. And ultimately, you're going to deal with the consequences. And then I think that second stage is that we live within communities of people. We're not isolated individuals. And what we do as individuals has an impact on that larger society. And the economy is just a subset of society. It's the means by which we meet our needs impersonally. Impersonal, instrumental, the impersonal, instrumental, individual needs. But we also have social needs, and we have ethical and moral needs that give purpose and meaning to our life, that give quality to our life. And so the economics has to fit within the context of the social, and that has to fit within the ecological. And what we've done is we turned it upside down, and we start with the economic, and we end up exploiting nature and exploiting society. And that's the reason what we're doing is not sustainable. So I apologize for the mini sermon, but as an economist, we cannot continue to give priority to economics and be serious about sustainability.
And are there natural laws of information that we're ignoring? And, you know, I'm doing this just for you, but now, is Elsevier like a drug house that we just keep going to over and over again? And we're just like ignoring the
Roll up
natural
my
laws
sleeve.
of, that's right. The natural laws of information, because we're in this mode that is a death spiral in a way. You know, I don't know how we get out of it, to be honest with you. I don't know how it's gonna end. I hope I live long enough to see it, but I don't know, you know, it's really our information ecology in higher ed in the United States in the year 2015 is really not sustainable, I would suggest.
Absolutely not. Yeah. Given the current economic models of information.
Scholarly
Yeah.
information.
Yeah. You know, that's one side of it, and that's commercially obtained information. But another aspect of the ecology of information is that which, you know, it's sort of like a tale of two cities, you know, from an information standpoint, this is the best of times and the worst of times, in that, you know, it's everywhere, but at the same time, it can dissolve in an instant. And, you know, a good example are the kinds of things that special collections and archives around the country collect these days, these regional or local collections that give some sense of the area. But they're selected, they're selective, they come either by happenstance or that sort of thing. But take correspondence, for example. You know, I'm trying to sort out a group of letters between my father and my aunt during World War II to track where my father was in Europe, because his records were lost in a fire in 1973 there in St. Louis at the U.S. Archive. But you know, most of the communication now is digital. You know, how many of you have written a letter in the last 6 months to somebody? You know, a long letter, a nice long letter to Aunt Mabel or, you know, Uncle, you know, that kind of thing. And, you know, the ecology of history, for example, how do we make information sustainable in a organized way? Or are we morphing into some sort of decentralized mode of utilizing information? You know, I think those are the kinds of questions that librarians really need to zero in on.
I think you know, one of the challenges of sustainability, and I think it relates to similarly to what you're talking about, is that information, if you think from this kind of holistic concepts of everything's interrelated, everything's a part of something else, then information is useful only within context. And so it's not that you have isolated pieces of information. You put those pieces together in a certain way, and you synthesize knowledge out of the whole. You know, you put together information in a certain way, and it has one meaning, and you rearrange it a little bit, and it means something else. You know, the whole is changed every time you change the arrangements of pieces. So how can you help people synthesize knowledge out of information? You know, you have all this information, and typically you say, okay, you go look for whatever you want. What is it you're looking for? And you're looking for individual pieces of information. But if you come in and you're looking for knowledge, then what pieces do you have that fit together so that that person learns what they need to learn? That's not just a collection of knowledge, it's a synthesis of knowledge that fits together in such a way that has meaning. And those are not kind of things that a lot of people think about when they think about sustainability, but I would argue that's the very crux of understanding these concepts. That's the reason. You can't say anything about sustainability just from an ecological standpoint. Because you have to consider the social and the economic or the individual consequences of that. So you can't say anything about sustainability from an economic perspective. It always has to be integrated with the other. So how do you provide integrated information in such a way that you can increase the knowledge and sustainability? And I think that's a challenge. I don't know the answer to it, but it seems to me like that, folks that deal with information, that would be an interesting kind of challenge to take on.
Traditionally, in the academy, it's been the research process and the promotion and tenure process, where you create, organize, you take data and, turn it into statistics and then add some value to it. Then you turn it over to a publisher who packages it, and then we buy it. And we're often the ones who produced it, of course. But we've got to find a more sustainable way to do that.
Most of that information is very isolated stuff. It's the reductionist approach. You look at the pieces, you get deeper and deeper into pieces. And they talk about multidisciplinary research. You write this piece, I'll write this piece, you write this piece. Nobody really understands what the other is doing. They just put it together so it looks multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. You get together and talk once in a while if it's interdisciplinary, but nobody understands what the other is doing. It's too complex, and that's not sustainability research. That's just the old repackaged sort of reductionist research. It's not dealing with the holes and things. I tell people I'm a better economist today than I've ever been in my life. One thing is I focused the last 15 years on what are the real important economic principles, but more important, in sustainability, I've had to focus on understanding enough about ecology and sociology and all the other things so that I understand how economics interrelates with those. So when I'm talking as an economist, I haven't spent the last 15 years building esoteric models that nobody reads anything about, that probably you could stack something in here in the library. I've been trying to really understand basic economic concepts and how those relate to how society functions and how they relate to nature and all that. And I'm just saying that's a different way of thinking that most people haven't gotten around to yet, but we'll eventually have to get there if we're serious about sustainability. So we have to be able to put together information, even if you're in an academic discipline, you have to be able to understand enough about the others and to synthesize that. If somebody comes in here looking for information, they have to pull together the pieces in a way that it makes sense as a whole. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perhaps.
I think that things that I read are arguing that we've really sort of reached a point in society in the U.S. with the developed first world societies that we're really too complex socially and intellectually to sustain ourselves. Meaning, you look at our different social systems, education, defense, government, almost name medicine, just name them. They're so big, they're so complex, they're so expensive that we've kind of tied ourselves up in knots. Agriculture, and you're really going to have to go back for sustainability to say, how do we break these things back down? Not back to the level they were maybe in our great-grandparents' time before, but maybe in our grandparents' time, down a level or two, where we can at least understand them. We don't even understand our own social systems. We do something over here, blows up over here, and we don't even know why.
Yeah, and I think that, again, is part of a different way of thinking. I think the systems are so complex and interrelated, they can't be managed. We're typically, when we're saying, well, you can't deal with them, it's not sustainable, we're saying we don't know how to manage those systems. They're too complex, we can't put together the information. But I think we have to go to say, okay, you're not managing the system, and go back to the fundamental principles of kind of healthy societies or healthy economies or whatever. And you say, if we have a lot of people that are doing different things, we don't have to understand what everybody's doing. But if we're all kind of functioning according to a set of common principles, and those principles are kind of in harmony with the underlying nature, including human nature, then the system kind of manages itself. We don't manage, when we talk about systems, I always like to go to the body, because we all have one of those, and some of us have had one a long time. So you kind of know how it works, but we don't manage this living system. We feed it, you know, and we keep it warm and things like that, but it pretty much does a lot of this stuff on its own. Now, if we abuse it, we can make it sick and we can kill it. But it's not like you're managing that system. I say sustainability, you know, managing a sustainable organization is a lot more like raising kids than it is like running a factory. Well, you don't raise kids according to some formula out here and do everything. You know, you kind of got some general guidelines in mind, and you try to do certain things and hope they grow up, you know. So you don't have to know everything about raising kids in order to have a healthy child. You just have to, you know, use some common sense and feed it, send it to school. But you see what I'm getting at? So we've got to turn loose of this idea that somehow we're in charge of everything. And we don't have to know everything. I tell people, all I really need to know is what I need to know to fulfill my particular purpose in life. That's kind of my philosophy. I don't need to know everything you need to know, because we don't have the same purpose. And I'm not going to try and tell you what to do. I don't need to know what someone else needs to know. I need the information that's relevant to the piece of the world that I can affect. And if I can find that, put it together, I don't have to know everything. I have to trust that you are going to do the same thing, and you're going to do the same thing. And that if we understand that that's what we all need to do, then somehow this whole system will manage itself like a living organism does. You know, we're not apart from the world in charge of it. It goes back to that worldview. We're one species among many, and we're fulfilling some sort of purpose here in relation to those others. That, it's just maybe philosophical, but I think sustainability is philosophical.
Well, that's interesting. And from an information standpoint, in a way, are our information systems actually working against that? And here's what I mean by that, is that it's so easy now to find out what's happening anywhere in the world. You know, tweets go out, you can see what's trending, that you lose track of what can you control. Not in a dominating way, but just what can you have any effect on? And it goes back to Dickens. In Bleak House, there was the woman who was in London, she was writing letters all day long, trying to raise the social conditions in a fictitious African nation called Boria Bulaga. And while she was doing that, her own kids were running amok on the streets of London. And they were not being fed and clothed and schooled. And the title of the chapter was Telescopic Philanthropy. You look clearly, well, there's a problem halfway around the world. I'm going to help that problem. Whereas we were talking again in this meeting, we have people in our community, in our region, who are severely undernourished, who have real caloric needs, and we have problems right here, and needs right here that we need to address. Which sounds like, regionalism, but we're part of a global community, but we have to pay attention to what we can do.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we look around and say, what can you reasonably influence here that's going to make a positive difference? I don't think anybody can answer that for you except yourself. You know, somebody else might be more right than I am, but that's not the way things, you know, it's my responsibility. I have to kind of figure that out, and in relation to the people that I relate to and others. You know, you're talking about all the information that's out there, and at times I kind of go crazy, you know, keeping up with the information. I just decided, one thing now, you know, the internet and all this kind of thing, but it comes from different places. I know a lot of different people around, and they kind of know what I'm interested in, they know what I'm working on, and they send me things, or they recommend books, or whatever. I've got to rely more and more on that, I think. And I sort through it, and I don't take on everything. But I'm not trying to understand everything that's going on in the world. I kind of have feelers out of the things that are kind of relevant to the things that I'm working on, I think I can do. And that's the way I kind of sort through all of that. Because there's just so much out there. If you try to take on the whole thing of sustainability, I can only kind of move in one dimension that's continuing to make sense to me, kind of evolving in ways making sense. And as I talk to other people, communicate with other people, they begin to send me, you know, articles or refer books or various other things that relate to what we're working to. We're working on this initiative of deep sustainability, trying to get beyond just doing things that are, you know, that are good for society, good for the nature, that are also profitable. We need to do those things. But we're trying to get beyond that and say there's certain things that have no economic value, that we've got to do just simply for social and ethical reasons. So people send me information that has to do with spirituality and sustainability, and ethics and sustainability, and articles that relate to them. So it's kind of sorting through the information, working on those things. 2 years from now, a year from now, if I'm still around, I'll probably be working on something else. I'm saying you don't need all the information in the world to carry out your mission, whatever you think that is.
So, you know, at one time in the 50s and 60s, we identified that kind of communication, usually in a closed environment, sort of a specialized environment, as invisible colleges, you know, gatekeepers, and, you know, and certain experts in the field, or, you know, in economics, it'd be a certain group, and in physics, another, and so on. I'm curious as to how the, you know, the unbinding, particularly through digital means, you know, of social communication now has changed that, and if it's affecting the validation of information into knowledge, you know, again, the academic process used to confer, you know, through peer review and that sort of thing. Now, you know, global news organizations and even local news organizations ignore filtered information, or, if you will, published information, and, you know, they rely on, you know, what's trending, what's, you know, their informal polls, you know, Google us, or not Google us, pardon me, you know, go in on Facebook and vote, you know, should this be passed or voted down, should, you know, and you know, they're always quoting polls, and polls then pull up a certain amount of validity, and is there a wisdom in the crowd, you know, in the ecology of information, and, you know, what is the role of a library in, or any other knowledge organization unit in filtering that for your consumers, you know, or are we essentially working our way out of a job eventually?
I wanted to add one thing, and I think that's a good question, but before we go on, you know, people send me stuff that's contrary to what our view is also. That's not a closing off of the community. Only listen to people that agree with you, because people are sending me constantly things that here's an argument against what we're doing, you know, and need to be able to address that. So I think that's part of the thing. But I don't know about the, you know, I'm not much on the filtering process. I guess I was in the academy too long. I don't believe that we were doing a very good job of filtering what ought to be done and what ought to be disseminated. I think we kind of got in the habit of having our own academic criteria that over time wasn't very relevant to what I see as the major challenges of society today. So we would disregard most of the information, or a lot of the information that I think is really good information. I think some of the best information around on sustainable agriculture is coming from people who went back to the science, what the scientists were working on in the 30s and the 40s. Some of them here in Missouri. William Albrecht he was president of the American Soil Association, American Agronomy Association, doing research on agriculture, soil health, animal health, human health, and how all that was related. You know, it's not up to date right now, but it's the starting point of the new research that ought to be done. But he's totally discredited at the University of Missouri. He was still in the department when I went there, but the time I got there, because he foresaw things that were going on. He was writing about this. He said, when you go to focusing on the economic bottom line and just maximizing production, just a very short part of it. He says you're going to focus on the elements that you can take from the air because they're abundant, and you can produce high levels of yields and so on. He says you're going to ignore the essential elements that are essential for human health and animal health and nutrition that are in the soil, because those things are limited. And if you think about what you get out of the air, it's carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, that's carbohydrates. He said you're going to end up with foods that are high in calories but lacking in essential nutrients. And so we're going to have a society that's undernourished, too many calories and too little nutrients. And he was saying that a couple of years ago. But I mean, the whole University of Missouri just kind of wrote all that off as irrelevant. We're just producing production, profitability, yield. That's where the money is. So I'm just giving you that as one example. So I'm not too high. I think people basically have to take responsibility for their own filtering. Maybe we help people understand they can't believe everything they read on the internet and things of that nature. But I don't want to be in the role of the censor that says this is irrelevant information. This is credible information. We're fed too much propaganda.
So, are you saying that the real root of the problem is not sort of resource management per se, but it's really the way we think about who we are, our relationship with nature, and how we can affect change? So, for instance, I find myself falling this too. I don't think I've done those 2 things, but if your body, something's bothering your body, well, drink a 5-hour energy drink, or there's something I can ingest that will solve that problem. Even if sometimes you realize it's only a temporary fix, eventually you're going to have to get some sleep, or you're going to have to. I went to a university where, who was it that was speaking, said that, the big difference between the university today and the university 25 years ago is caffeine. Really, everything else, we're the same people, but we're now this caffeine-infused culture. That it wasn't that way, There
It's available all the time right out here.
I know, it never closed.
I think we just weren't doing it in fancy ways.
We said I got
For instance, a teaspoon of Maxwell with the Coke, and now you just go to Starbucks and get a hot
Take a no-dose.
But it's the problem is up here, the way we think about ourselves and our place in the broader environment.
I agree with that. I think that's really where I'm coming from, and the question is how does that change? What kind of information people need, how they put it together, all of that. I just bought this book. I've got a stack of books. I don't just read everything off the internet. But I've got this book, and everybody's recommending it. Naomi Klein says, "This changes everything." I just love that title because it does. When you change the thinking, just as you described, and I couldn't have described it any better, is what I'm thinking about. That changes everything else. When you rethink who we are, how we fit, how we ought to live our lives, what's the purpose of us being here. When you rethink that changes everything else in your life. It changes everything you do, the way you see things. It changes everything. And I think it changes the way people, what kind of information they need, how they make sense out of it, what they do with that information, just like it changes the way people farm and grow food, the way people, where they live and how they live. And I think it changes everything. And I think the challenge to you in the library is, well, how does it change our function as librarians? How do we address this way of thinking? And it's not comfortable because you're talking about dealing with these philosophical, spiritual, scientists don't give any credibility at all to life having any purpose, because you can't prove that there's any purpose to life. So in science, this is just all a mindless process of biological, physical, electronic impulses that are coming. Every word that comes out of my mouth is predetermined by some physical, biological, electronic stuff. I have no control of it whatsoever. It just goes on and on and on. See, I mean, that's where science is. So when you start talking about, okay, we're gonna have to rethink what the purpose of life is and where we fit, and what our responsibility is to nature and other living things, that's not gonna make logical, scientific sense. So you gotta be prepared to say, here's where we're going with it, here's why we're going. You know, my answer is, without purpose, life makes no sense whatsoever. If there's no purpose for us being here, it doesn't matter what we do. I say, you know, if there's no purpose, then why get up in the morning? But then why not? You know? But so what's right and what's wrong? If it doesn't make any difference what you do, anything's all right, but everything might be wrong. There's no way of knowing.
But I think that's where the relational aspect comes in, how we relate to one another, you know,
Yeah.
socially and as a
Yeah,
society.
you say, well, we got to treat each other well. Why?
Well, it's to your advantage over time.
Yeah, but if you're,
You don't wanna hack off
if I'm
something.
meaningless and you're meaningless, well, then how do you get any meaning out of that relationship? If I disappear, it doesn't make any difference. You know what? And you know, you can argue that philosophically, but my point is, if you're concerned about sustainability, then sustainability by its very nature, meeting the needs of the present without diminishing opportunities for the future. If there's no purpose for humans being here, there's no reason to sustain them. And if you're concerned just about the rest of the natural environment, then the best thing we ought to do is depopulate the Earth of humans as quickly as we can. So sustainability assumes there's some good purpose for humans being here. That, you know, our purpose is good, because if we're destructive, then do away with it. So if you're serious about sustainability, it's built on the assumption that there is some purpose for humans being here, and that purpose is good. And if you don't have that as the foundation, then nothing else we're talking about makes any sense. That's what I believe.
Well, I had an idea, I was thinking about sustainability, and we laboriously filled up a dumpster with all of the different paper materials, and I thought we could take it out and put it in the restrooms, and have, you know, in my mom's day and the grandparents' day, that's what they used. I mean, as a 1 week or well, 1 day, however, it could be extremely uncomfortable for some things. But you know, I mean, it's a statement. You know, it's a statement.
No, I think you
Just do
know,
more
we're
ways
talking about
of being.
philosophical stuff. It's probably time to go to some practical things you can do.
Well, here's another thought. It's kind of a, you know, I was thinking last night today is that, are we really gonna get serious about sustainability without scarcity? I mean, when you know, trying to start a fire is that last match that you really pay attention to.
And is it even possible in a capitalistic system? You feel like sustainability is possible in a capitalistic system?
My sustainable capitalism.
We're sailing.
It depends, it really depends on how you define, you know, capitalism. A lot of people define capitalism in such a way that there'd be no way. But capitalism as it's existed in this country, at least up until the last 25, 30 years or so, I'm not sure what we've got left now. But it wasn't totally unrestrained capitalism. We had the New Deal, we had Social Security, we had old age pensions. You know, when I was growing up, I can still remember when people talk about old age pension and Social Security. But before that, people basically starved or froze to death or whatever if they didn't have family to take care of them. So we come in and we had a whole lot of what you can call socialist programs that are ingrained in our society and always have been there. So with that kind of capitalist system, you can have sustainability. I don't think it's sustainable where we have now, but it's back to that hierarchy again. To have a sustainable capitalistic system, it has to be considered within the context of society, an equitable and just society. And the economy then has to function in such a way that it doesn't compromise or destroy this sense of social justice and equity. And that's basically the function of a democratic government. It's supposed to set the bounds and set the limits and have the regulations that says, okay, within this, we can function as individuals with our maximum liberty, but we have to consider the needs of other people. we're not totally free as individuals to do anything we want to do. We have to obey the laws and things like that. Well, the same thing needs to apply to the economy. That the economy has to function within bounds so that it's not destroying the natural resources, it's not degrading society, it's not exploiting people. And there has to be some sense of social equity and justice, economic equity and justice within the system. And then we as a society have to function within these laws of nature, the fundamental principles of how people relate to each other. And the way that relates to is our basic human rights. I would argue that those are laws of nature. That if you want to have a society that's sustainable over the long run, then people have to relate to each other in this way. So our society has to reflect those underlying laws of human nature, of human relationships, and then the economy has to accommodate the needs of society, which can vary greatly in terms of social value as long as you don't violate those underlying social principles of relationship. And the economy then can function in a very effective way. And as long as it's a competitive, economically competitive economy, which we don't have today, then it'll do a better job than anything you can come up with in making all of those little decisions about who produces what and who gets what and how things, what styles are in or styles are out or whatever. And as long as you works within the bounds of society and we function within the bounds of nature, then it can be sustained. But if you turn it upside down and let the economy dictate everything, then no. And that's what I say in my book. We have to put it back in its proper perspective relative to society and nature. I don't think you can do away with the market economy in a complex society as we have today. There's too many things going on to have anybody centrally planning who plants every crop and where it's cropped, and where it's planted, who makes every piece of thing and makes every piece of digital equipment and all that kind of stuff. A lot of those things don't do any damage to society. They're good for quality of life. Let the markets do those things that it needs to do. And then let's take responsibility for ensuring that the economy functions in a way that's not destructive for society or destructive for nature. That's the short answer. It's longer.
So in your book, do you envision capitalism that is not predicated on just endless economic growth?
Absolutely. I just think endless economic growth is just inconceivable, but most economists just assume it straight off the bat. They say human imagination, technology offset everything. Well, everything that's of any use to us comes from the earth. It has some material component. Now, you can go further and further in terms of adding value relative to that component. But ultimately, you're using up the usefulness of that material resources. And it's called dematerialization. And what we've done historically is we have become more efficient in using energy and natural resources. What happens is the price goes down, we use more of them anyway. We just produce more stuff from it. So we're not, so to have sustainability in terms of endless economic growth, Buckmaster Fuller came up with a concept of ephemeralization, which means you produce more and more with less and less until eventually you can produce everything with nothing. Now that's the underlying economic assumption of neoclassical economics. Ultimately, we produce everything. And I got into discussions, well, just say, okay, you can produce more economic value without using any more. Like you take a cell phone, for example. You get a new cell phone, and let's say there's no more material in it, there's no more human input than the old cell phone, but it's worth more than the other one in your mind, so you'd be willing to pay more for it. So you didn't use any more resources to get that. So as you produce more and more of that, then you have this sort of imaginary value out of creating this change. You end up with an economy where 99.9% of everything is made up of imaginary value that evolved without any material input whatsoever. But the only people that can make a living in that economy are people that know how to dream up imaginary value out of nothing. And so virtually all of your economies off here in the ether sphere somewhere or other, and the material economy is nothing. So I'm just saying it doesn't make any sense. We've got to recognize that there are basic limits to what we can do here. And I think we're up against them already. I think the reason the economy hasn't moved basically in the last 10 years is we're bumping against the natural limits in terms of human resources, in terms of natural resources. And this fracking thing, another give another jolt of the liquor or whatever it is we're addicted to.
Coke and Folgers.
Yeah. And soon it's gone. And then we have no idea what we're doing to the crust of the earth with all this stuff.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I think we need to challenge some of those.
We have to fight the propaganda to do that, though.
Well, confront the propaganda, that's what we have to do. It's just go ahead and say, look, this doesn't make sense. We've got to change it.
What do you think about, let me introduce a thesis and you can respond to it. I would suggest that in America, our collective sense of the value of public goods has really declined in the last 25, 30, 40 years. That even now, was it this said the last week, that really what's happening is that the state is getting out of funding higher education because their unstated thesis is this is basically a private good, not a public good. And therefore, if you want to go to college and you want to increase your chances of making more money and leading a better life,
Right.
that's up to you. It's a private good. You find somebody that willing to fund you, it's not going to be the state. That's just the case, public, national parks, you pay a fee now to get in national parks. Tollways are constantly being, it's just, we're just chiseling away at the notion that, the very notion of a public good that has value to society in and of itself.
Right.
Libraries are part of that too. I think we're kind of, we are spending our cultural capital, or it's being spent for us, or it's sort of diminishing because of this inexorable decline in the perceived value of public goods.
I agree with you 100%. And I think the forces now are trying to push toward kind of the theoretical capitalist economy without any constraints. And this perception of the public good somehow being separate from the individual well-being is an obstacle to moving in that direction. I try to tell people, I don't take differences with people personally. I don't think they're necessarily evil people. There's just people that think, well, things aren't working very well, so let's just try a purely capitalistic system. And it so happens that those are people that have a lot of money and they have political influence because they have a lot of money. And as a result of that, that's what's driving kind of the public policy at the state and federal level, everywhere else. You talk about, what's the priority of even local government, state government, to create jobs. That's not the primary function of government. You go back and look at the Declaration of Independence. It talks about what government's for. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We're all created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And the next thing is to ensure these rights. Governments are instituted among men, it says, but it should have said people. But it says government. That's the purpose. Deriving its just power from the consent of the government. You look at the preamble to the Constitution. It says, people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the general common defense, promote the general welfare, ensure the blessings of it. It says that's the purpose of government. All that's common good. Nowhere in there does it say to promote maximum economic growth.
Provide jobs.
Provide jobs. Those are those are permissible. That somehow promotes the underlying good, but that's not the priority. The reason to have government is there are certain things we have to do together for the common good that we can't do individually. I was trying to come up with a good example of, one of those things I think would make sense. And I say, what if individually we decide we're not going to get together to build highways? That's an individual's responsibility to provide for transportation. And I looked up and kind of the average cost of a 2-lane paved road is about $5 million per mile. And it varies from 3 or 4 million up to 10 or 12 million, depending on where you are. So if you set aside $10,000 for 50 years, your whole adult lifetime, at the end of that period of time, you could build 1/10 of a mile, wherever you could go. But if you live in a town like Fairfield, Iowa, which is 10,000 people, and you set aside $1,000 a year, a tenth this much, for 50 years, and so did everybody else, then we could build 100 miles of road. And 100 miles of road in Fairfield, if they went down to 10, 20 miles, they built 100 miles, somebody else, then we can go anywhere. For a tenth as much, by working together, we can go anywhere. If we want to do it by ourselves, we can go a tenth of a mile. There are certain things that economists call that fallacy of composition, but there are a whole range of things that we can't do as individuals. And those things don't get done if we don't find some way to make government work. And I argue right now, our government isn't working, but if we're going to have sustainability, our governments have to work. We have to have something that sets the bounds. What we're doing right now is removing all those bounds. When you take away policies that are meant to protect the common good, meant to serve the common good, you're removing all of those bounds to exploitation. And I think there are people that are in positions of power today, the economic powerful, their pursuit of the maximum economic well-being, in particular for the large corporations. Once you lose that personhood, you lose the ability for social and ethical values, large publicly traded corporations. Then once you get to that point, then we can't control them. That's what they're going to do. They're going to use all of the political clout they've got to privatize everything, because that creates opportunity to increase profitability. And we're in the middle of that, and I see that. We were interviewing this morning when I started the University of Missouri in 1957. We didn't have tuition. The total fees for a year were $125. Almost anybody could go to school. I went to school, I had a curator's scholarship for $125. I sold an old pallet saw and 4 pigs. That gave me enough to get started. I worked my way through school working in the cafeterias, and I wasn't the only one. There was all kinds of people who did. You couldn't do that. That was somebody investing in me, and a lot of other people like me. We had a lot of veterans come back, there. Somebody investing in the public good. We're just sacrificing tremendous amounts of that. Sustainability challenges that. That gives you a logical way of challenging them. By saying, look, that's not sustainable. Just pursuing the individual self-interest, economic self-interest, is not sustainable. And it gives you a logical basis to go back. It's not sustainable because of this, because of this, because of this. And I think that's an important part of it. It's helping people understand we can't continue doing this.
I'm on shaky ground here. I was reading something the other day that suggested that, somewhat parallel to late 19th, early 20th century, things approaching monopoly, railroads, energy, oil, and so on, that now some of our information entities, i.e. Google, Microsoft, name a few others, in terms of scale, gotten so large and in effect influence and dominate the information industry so much that we're approaching the same sort of thing, but that there's no room, there's less room or flexibility for the individual or for smaller entities to make inroads there in the way that, without perhaps some sort of intervention, as we were talking about earlier, for public good. And I'm just throwing this out for general comment, can that happen in the information enterprises?
What came up, one of the things that came up last night at dinner, if you could maybe talk about this again, is the question came up of whatever happened to the antitrust division of the Justice Department?
Yeah.
That they haven't done anything really noticeable in, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. Since AT&T, which was in the 80s.
Right.
And when Exxon and Mobil, I'm ranting now, but when Exxon and Mobil merge and they do nothing, which is why they were created back in 1910 to split up Standard Oil.
Yep.
where are we at? And so you have a nice framework that you've used
Yeah,
to
and
deal with this kind of thing.
And I was saying, when I was in graduate school, I took a whole course of market organization, I think is what it was called, but it was on this whole area of like antitrust. But we talked, I'll make it very short, we talked about the general ideas of structure, conduct, and performance. So you look at an industry, and the structure was how many firms are there? Because to truly have a competitive firm, we call that atomistic competition, you have to have a large number of small firms so that no one individual can have a significant impact on market prices or things as a whole, so that any advances get passed on to the consumer, that sort of thing. So large number of small firms, but conduct then is how they relate to each other. Are they getting together and colluding and fixing prices and that sort of thing? We've got to have a number of firms, but if they're colluding, they're acting like one, like a monopoly. And then the third was performance, and the idea was that in economic theory that a monopoly would raise prices and reduce output so that they could raise prices, so they make it more scarce and prices would go up. And then the other thing was that they would quit innovation. They wouldn't have any pressure for technological innovation, so you'd have kind of stagnant thing. So what economists did over time, they said, okay, it's a lot of trouble to deal with market structure. We're getting, these firms are getting bigger. So, and then conduct, we can kind of deal with that, but we don't know. So why don't we just start looking at the performance? Why don't we just look at output, price, and then innovation? So that's where they began to focus everything. And what they didn't recognize, and what they still don't pay any attention to, that when you've got a number of firms and they're competing for market share, like a Walmart's coming into an area, when they first come in, they're going to lower prices, they're going to increase production, and if they want to stay ahead like a Google or an Apple or whatever, they're going to have constant innovation while they're taking more and more share of the market. But eventually then they get in a position where they can begin to influence policy, and they're getting subsidies, and they don't have any competition, so nobody knows what we'd be paying without them. And so they just kind of abandon structure and conduct. They just prosecute enough cases so they don't totally depopulate the antitrust division, because those guys like their jobs, But there's really been no enforcement. So we have no idea of whether our market is giving us the things that are really good for us or not. Because the only way, and this is again in my book, the only way that you can be assured that the invisible hand in Adam Smith that's guiding us toward the things that allocating resources in an efficient way is if you have a competitive market structure, if you have a large number of small firms. And the other thing I was talking about before that I want to explain about corporations. Corporations are neither good or evil. A family corporation is no different than a family. They can express their social and ethical values in the way they run the business. A small corporation, you can form a corporation here of like-minded people, you can do what you want to do. But when you get a large publicly traded corporation, they may be good people that are shareholders and managers, but they're scattered all over the world, and they have different social and ethical values, different religions, nationalities, ages, education levels. The only thing they have in common is the desire to increase the economic value of their stock. And so the only common value that the corporation a for-profit corporation can pursue is that value of increasing the value of their stock. And the individuals that work there, to the extent that they can make decisions that are good for society and nature, that don't compromise the economic bottom line, they can do it, but they can't go beyond that. And then people have argued, well, the corporate managers and things, they can relate to different people and so on. But now we've got a lot of these stocks are owned by pension funds and mutual funds, and people don't even know which stock they own. I used to have some mutual fund that send me a report once a year. It's like a magazine with thousands of companies that I own a little bitty piece of on one day. How am I going to reflect my social values through all those companies? And when you got electronic trading, people are only own a share for a minute, second, fraction of a second. We created something that's purely asocial and amoral. It's just a purely economic organization, and we have to give them, ethical and social values, or they're just going to pursue economic exploitation and extraction. And you can't expect them to do anything else. The people that are within them are helpless. And so if you can't make government work, and I think there's, I hate to be on sinister plots, but I got the feeling they want government to be dysfunctional, because as long as government's not functioning, there's no way to control it.
Is there another kind of a monopoly afoot here? It seems to me, just as a junkie citizen, that, you know, it doesn't matter on the sector, whether it's canned vegetables or refrigerators or flu vaccine. When you really get down to it, there are very few manufacturers of any of that stuff anymore.
That's right.
And so if one flu vaccine manufacturer has some kind of production problem, suddenly there's a shortage. Maybe you deal with this in your small farms or real farms book,
Okay.
but, you know, there's something that tends towards largeness.
It is.
And how do you break that?
It's back to this priority on economics. And the thing that tends toward largeness, and I'll talk some about this tonight, is this industrial paradigm. You know, we tend to think of industrialization as moving from agrarian to manufacturing society. That's just a symptom of it. The industrial process is specialization, standardization, and then consolidation and control. And Adam Smith talked about, you know, specialization making pins. You know, you specialize in cutting the wire and sharpening, putting on the head, you can increase production 40-fold. But they said you have to standardize each of those processes. And then once you specialize and standardize, then you can begin to mechanize. You know, saying they probably spit out 1,000 pins a second nowadays out of the big machines somewhere. But that's that principle. And the same thing in agriculture or manufacturing cars or whatever. They break those processes down, and there's all these specialized functions like going through an assembly line. Each one of those has a specific function to carry out. It's all standardized. Then you mechanize all of those simplified as you can. And everybody else is just doing basically what they're told. So you've simplified that whole management process. So you have one manager now that can run a whole big factory. Whereas when you had craftsmen, you know, they were there working on piece by piece. So all of that's driven by economic efficiency. You do it faster, you do it with less material. But basically what you're saving is on labor. And you're making the labor, fewer people are working, you're mechanizing, simplifying the process, each one of them is more productive. And the jobs that they're doing are less skilled jobs that require less thinking than what they're told, so you pay them less. Then you got fewer managers that you have to pay. So the big savings is on the human cost that goes into it. You know, we shouldn't be surprised that when the economy's not growing fast, you have that sort of process still going on, then you create unemployment that just comes out of that system. But that's how you end up in the larger and larger operations, because you get more and more specialized, standardized, consolidated into larger and larger units. And then you go beyond what the individual can finance, and then you go to corporate financing so everybody can combine their. And then the economists justify that as economies of scale. They say, well, we've got to go to the larger operations because they're more economically efficient, so we just let them get larger and larger. But it's the driving force of economics. If you moved away from that and said the driving force is not just the economic efficiency, but we've got to provide quality employment opportunities for people. You know, we're not just consumers, that we're workers. We need something useful to do. And then you would create technology that would allow people to be more productive. You'd have more thinking occupations that required more education and more knowledge, but the person could earn more money because they're doing more individually themselves. And you would move toward more labor and higher quality labor sort of thing. But you couldn't accumulate all of the capital among a few people. You'd be spreading it all out. It wouldn't be as economically efficient. But people would be leading better lives because they'd be doing something useful all day. And then you could take care of the environment and lots of other things once you started doing that. But it's gonna cut into economic efficiency. You're not gonna be able to concentrate as much wealth that way. So that's the reason we don't do it.
Sort of related to scale, what Tom was talking about is, particularly in higher education, is this market-driven, consumer-driven, because we're competing for, at the moment, a smaller group of students, you know, and Ritzer, you know, in his McDonaldization of society, there's a spin-off of that somebody wrote, what, maybe 10 years ago, Bill, 12 years ago, about the McDonaldization of the library and the way in which we cater to the consumer. You know, students are going to school to get a job, and so they They want just certain amounts of information, just enough to get there. And it leads to what the author, whose name I can't remember, termed an information happy meal, that we organize, codify, break down.
What's the
Those-
toy?
Those of you, who are in reference in government information know this, they're perfectly satisfied with, find me 5 articles, they gotta be full text, I don't wanna run down to the stacks and look for them or use the scanner, or the photocopier, nowadays. And, ultimately, that's got to, and then on the production side, kind of in the vein of Tom's question, we are experiencing a shrinking market too. There are there are basically 3 serial journal vendors now in the world. 1 German and 2 US, and then some smaller ones. There are, and one of the largest US ones just swallowed up the largest book vendor in the United States, so it's all one company now. We have, just as in the way of biodiversity, we have much less diversity in terms of editorial content, what gets published, who's keeping the gates, what gets reviewed, that sort of thing. So it continues to be concentrated, so that all the libraries in Missouri are going to buy, this small group of the same things because they feel they need them because their students use them. And diversity of information, which I assume is sort of or diversity in itself is sort of an important aspect of sustainability, I think is going to continue to be a problem for a while.
Yeah, I think we've applied that industrial model just everywhere. It's in the universities, it's in the schools, it's in the elementary schools, it's even in the churches. You go to church, and what do you have? You have this specialized. You have the minister of youth, the minister of media, the minister of this. And you have the prime minister. It's this hierarchical kind of arrangement. You go in and you have this order of worship. 1, 2, 3, like the run to Eucharist and salvation on demand.
And what's crazy is exactly this whole modernization of the civil case, yet at the same time, when you look at the costs. I was in a meeting a couple months ago, and they talked about our financial aid, what they assume the cost of attendance is here. And basically, it's $15,000 a year, more involved in that, but that's the basic number. So if a kid is here for 5 years, he or she is going to go through $75,000 of somebody's money, possibly to get a degree in English, let's say. Let's just say, should it cost in the same system $75,000 to get a degree in English?
Yeah.
As opposed to, say, one of the sciences that is more expensive to deliver, you gotta have labs and so forth. But in English, where it's books and people to talk about the books. And, so we got this modernization thing, and yet, what you said,
It's got
when you went to
charging
school
with the bear.
in the
But-
50s, it didn't cost
Yeah,
$75,000.
and the other point is that beyond some level, it's no longer about being more efficient or ranking at lower cost. Once you basically removed kind of the competitiveness, the ability of the competitors. It's more about the ability to control the market. It's about market power, and it's about political power. And once you've lost the competitive system that would have ensured, some sort of competitive cost level, then you no longer know what it really costs. You don't have any comparison. And you can't get started, you can't just come in and start another university and compete with the universities that are out there, because you kind of created this illusion if you don't go to these particular universities, then your degree isn't worth that much. And so you kind of like you've got market power now within the educational system, and you have these elite universities at the top up here, I don't know, just astronomical what you have to pay to get into those. And people start prepping their kids before they go to kindergarten to those places. You just have to know somebody. So that's pure market power in the academy. And it has nothing to do with what it really costs, I would argue, to give somebody a quality education. I don't think it should cost nearly as much most anywhere. I think in the research institutions, the students are subsidizing the research end of the whole operation, which is driving all of the publications and journal articles and all the prestigious things and fund these high salaries that these people, in my opinion, most of what is, how much anymore, when I was still, most of what was going on there, they were just writing articles to impress each other that hardly ever anybody else read. And the only people that read them were graduate students that they were teaching how to write other articles that nobody read. So and the students going to school to get an instruction are paying for all of that. And these professors, making $150,000, $200,000 just writing articles for each other.
The greatest.
One reason I'm a better economist than I used to be is I don't read that stuff anymore.
Can I ask you a commodity question before we run out of time? So, a lot of people in librarianship and information science assert, to some degree, that information is different than most other commodities. So, you can give it away and still retain it. It may actually may increase the value of what you have if you give it away. And when done right, information can diffuse at nearly the speed of light. So a question, thought experiment I was phrased on a Facebook post is, if that's true, why hasn't, at least the information that's born digital, why isn't it completely diffused now? Why don't we all know all the information that's out there to be known? Assuming that we could do that we could, have the capacity for that. Because it's like habit, culture, legal constraints, economics maybe, I don't know. But, is information fundamentally different? I guess my question, I'm getting to a question. Is information fundamentally different than most other countries, even air?
Yeah, I think it is in regard that you talked about it, because you're not using it up. And it really becomes more valuable in a sense the more people have it. But I think one reason you're trying to see more and more of it privatized, and I think you'll see more and more of that, is to stop disseminating that initial information freely and to make it more difficult to pass it on to somebody else. So I think there's a real attempt to try to monopolize the information and try to make it into a privatized commodity.
If we own it.
Yeah, but you have to figure out some way to do that legally, like through copyrights and restricted copyrights and things of that nature. You can't copy this and that, whatever, because otherwise it is just free. And you're going to have continuing pressure to try to take control of the internet, because that's a potentially just a tremendously valuable asset out there that you can get control of it. But as long as it's there and everybody can pick it up, it's free. And I think it's an important thing. If we lose free access to information, we basically lost our democracy.
Yeah.
Is what it amounts to.
It's really pretty amazing the internet emerged in the conditions in which it emerged. It's almost
It didn't emerge from IBM and
No.
Hewlett Packard and all the big companies. It emerged from people on the side that those people
really emerged because
sneaked up on them.
we didn't think the Soviets really, because it was designed to survive a Soviet attack.
The defense
Yeah.
network.
Yeah. I can remember the first email message I got is almost like writing a computer program to send an email message back then. Because the scientists, you had to have all of this stuff up front, and this thing and that thing, and you had a little bit of text down there. But it was just researchers, that communicating with each other. But it sure evolved into something. I think it's the internet is great and the information is great because it democratizes information. I don't think it should be seen as a challenge. It's maybe a challenge to the libraries to figure out how you fit into the new information environment. But I still think there's a very important role for tangible kind of things that you can see and read. Like I say, I've got a stack of books I haven't done reading that I'm going to read at home. Well, there's plenty of stuff I could read off of the internet, or read off that sort of thing that I have. Certainly need to have the hardcover kind of stuff that you read. And I think, this other thing I hope you think about in the future is this personalized information. How can you help people share information face to face? That's important in sustainability, is getting together, collaborative learning. You get a group of people, just like we're getting together here this afternoon, you know. I'm learning and everybody else, so we're relating to each other, you know, directly. And I think that's an important part of the new sort of learning process. You integrate this information, bounce it off other people, and you take their comments and see where they fit. Try to move that forward. But, you know, there's some place that, I don't know how you do that, just some way that the library can facilitate that. You know, you can't do that on the internet. You can't do that with a quick copy and everything. So if you find some way to facilitate that kind of information, sharing, synthesis, all that.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm trying to come up with a better idea than that. I'll come up with a paper review, but you have a room and you have, this is where you're going to all come in and plug in your cell phone, but you can't use your cell phone. We're all gonna talk about sustainability.
Very good.
That way.
Yeah.
Bait and switch.
Yeah. That's it.
Well, and just because we talked about all this philosophical sustainability stuff, I think, you know, the things that you think about are important things to do, you know, the tool sharing, information sharing of various kinds, and doing the things in the library that demonstrate sustainability. You know, I think all those are important, but you probably have been talking about those other places, and you can read about those other places. So I'm glad we took a little time this afternoon, you know, to just kind of share some feelings and ideas about the deeper stuff. It's been useful to me, you know, kind of know where you're coming from and thinking. I'm learning all the time. I tell people I've learned way more since I retired than I ever learned in graduate school. Probably more than I learned in the 30 years in the university system. You know, you never stop learning. You know, you interact with people, read stuff that's interesting to you, take on new challenges. So I appreciate you sharing some time with me today. I think we got another appointment at 4 or something, right?
Yes.
Thank you all for coming.